Good morning and welcome to Begin in the Word. Today we continue our studies in the book of Ephesians. We're up to Ephesians chapter 4 now, verses 9 and 10. Ephesians 4, verse 9 and 10. Now this, he ascended, what does it mean? That he also first descended into the lower parts of the earth. He who descended is also the one who ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. Now, this comes on the heels of him talking about Christ's ascension. We talked about in the previous study about his ascension after his resurrection from the grave. And here Paul gives commentary about this ascension. And he said it's tied to Christ descending first of all. So what's this all about? Well, Christ descended to the earth when he was born. Philippians 2, verse 6 and 7 talks about him humbling himself and being made in the fashion of a man. And then goes on and says he humbled himself all the way to the death on the cross. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 through 17 takes up the idea of Christ becoming fully human when he was born into the world as a human, as a man. So that is certainly a part of how Christ descended. He came from heaven to earth to live as a man on our behalf so that he might facilitate our salvation. But here the text talks about him descending into the lower parts of the earth. So that seems to be more than just him becoming a human. And I believe we could say that probably speaks to his burial at his death. Matthew 12:40, for as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man 3 days and 3 nights be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. So here, Jesus, foretelling his death and his burial, speaks of himself as the Son of Man being in the heart of the earth. He, in his death and in his grave, his body being in the tomb, was in the lower parts of the earth. So he descended to the earth from heaven when he was born as a human, fully human, but then he also descended at his burial in his death. Now, he ascended from that status. That's what the ascension is about, is his resurrection. So let's look at that. Christ ascended after his resurrection, and you can read about that in Mark 16, and Luke 24, and Acts 1, and of course that's referenced other places in the New Testament. So he ascended, and that is about him ascending far above all. What does that mean? Well, we've already studied in the Ephesian epistle that when he ascended, he was seated at the right hand of God in Ephesians 1, verse 20 through 22, and God exalted him above all principalities and powers. So with these words, Paul is revisiting the theme of Christ's ascension and his exaltation and his kingship on his throne that he raised earlier in the Ephesian letter. So what did that ascension do? It enabled Christ to fulfill his mission. It enabled him to accomplish the work that God sent him to do. What did Paul say in the text? He ascended far above all the heavens. Why did he do that, Paul? That he might fill all things. Look, if Christ wasn't ascended and seated at God's right hand and given the full authority of his throne, then he did not accomplish all his work. There are views out there that say that Christ doesn't rule on his throne yet, that he won't rule until after after the final resurrection, or after his second coming. That view is sometimes referred to as premillennialism, and that view says that his reign doesn't come until after his second coming. If that's the case, then he doesn't reign today, and if he doesn't reign today, he has not filled all things. He has not accomplished his mission, and I just want to tell you, that is not true, friends. Christ has achieved the work that God sent him to do. He did not fail. And this ascension into heaven completes a picture that we're taught about in the Old Testament. Look at what Deuteronomy 30 says about the law. Deuteronomy 30, verse 11 and 12 says, this commandment which I command you today is not too mysterious for you, nor is it far off. It is not in heaven that you should say, who will ascend into heaven for us and bring it to us, that we may hear it and do it. And then he goes on to explain that they had the commandment of God, or Moses' law, right there with them. So woven into Moses' law, description of itself, woven to the description of the law is the language that says man cannot ascend into heaven on his own behalf. So Moses' law said we didn't go up into heaven to get this law and bring it. God sent it down to us. So there's this idea that man can't go into heaven on his own behalf, but that implies that God will do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And language from this context is used in the New Testament to describe God sending his Son down from heaven. Why? Because we can't go to heaven to get God's help on our own. We can't ascend into heaven on our own behalf. But what we can't do, God in love is willing to do for us. The writer of Proverbs 30 takes this idea up. He said, "Who has ascended into heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his Son's name, if you know?" Now here he asks rhetorical questions that speak of God's creative power, of him gathering the winds and binding the waters, of establishing the ends of the earth. And as he speaks of God's creative power, he rhetorically asks the question, what is his name? And then look at what else he says. What is his Son's name? Now here Solomon, or whoever we regard the author of the tail end of Proverbs to be, that author picks up the language of descending from heaven and ascending back into heaven, and he uses that language to infer God's Son. That same language we find in the law as a description of the idea that what man can't do for himself, God will do for him. And Christ completed this picture when he, as the Word, was made flesh. John 1:14 says that the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. He lived among us. He descended from heaven down to earth on our behalf, gave his life for us, descended into the grave, into the lower parts of the earth on our behalf, doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. And that is the beauty of which Paul writes in God's plan and how he describes it in Ephesians 4, verse 9 and 10. God's own Son descended down from heaven for you, gave his life in that bitter death on the cross for you, and then resurrected from the grave, having the keys of the grave in his hand and the hope of your own resurrection for you. And he ascended into heaven to rule on his throne for you, so that you could be saved. Won't you follow him? Won't you give your life to him? Won't you live your life by the instruction he gives in the Word? I'm so glad that you've joined us for today's study of the Word of God. And as we've begun today in the Word, I pray that you'll live out today and every day in the mighty Word of God. Thank you, and God bless.